Hi, welcome. My name is Michael Hampton. I published a book titled Figure Drawing, Design, and Invention a decade ago. Today I'm going to talk about gesture and anatomy, a really interesting but confusing pairing. The two terms on the surface seem to be irreconcilable. Gesture is a principle or a subject that's often thought to be relatively expressive and loose. Anatomy is considered to be the opposite. It's finite, it's structured, it's scientific. And so those two things, which are, in terms of drawing, naturally the beginning and the end, are generally seen without much connection. To get started, what we'll be doing today is beginning with diagramming, right? And trying to make some sense out of these two topics. So on the one hand, we'd have anatomy, and then let's position over here gesture. Again, part of what I think is interesting or somewhat problematic about these two terms is that they just seem to be total opposite ends of the drawing spectrum. What we would usually consider gesture to be is something that might be expressive or an underdrawing or very loose. So it doesn't often feel as though this is hitting on principles of contour or the very end, whereas anatomy might be the opposite. This is very finished. Like I said, it's finite. There isn't a lot of interpretation of anatomy in the traditional sense. For me, it's an interesting problem. How do we build a bridge, or how do you kind of create some kind of connection between these? And I think in a certain sense, that's going to be relatively personal for everybody. And I'm a huge fan of that. I don't teach in a way that's dogmatic. I don't adhere to one style as if it's a religion. I think it's good to be stylistically promiscuous, to pull from everybody. Drawing is really kind of problem solving. And in that sense, gesture and anatomy kind of harken back to a very consistent problem in the arts. Not problem so much, but definition for how drawing is always thought of. That is the autographic, or the personal, over that of the rational. And this has been a topic of drawing since Plato, really. In the Renaissance, which we'll talk about, the idea would be that the rational is an expression of Neoplatonism or humanism, and the autographic, or the personal, the mark making, is what makes the work look like Michelangelo or Da Vinci or Durer. But they're all working on the same project. It's all about re-engaging with antiquity. Just as an aside, I am a big believer in not siloing yourself off in your own comfortable genre. So I think we should always be looking at everything. We should be open to having a generous perspective toward the fine arts, toward illustration, toward art history. These are three subjects that I love and that I have pursued independently. What I've learned while pursuing them is that each camp, almost to the T, hates the other. Illustrators don't like fine artists because they believe that they don't have skills. Fine artists don't always appreciate illustration because they believe they don't have ideas. And then art historians think that both of them are just vessels for them to interpret. So to me, a more generous perspective would be to start to look at all of these together, right? For me, these represent the three most important categories for developing art. Illustration sometimes is the how. It's the hand. It's how we make things. Fine art might be the why, the concept. And then we could think of the history as what it is that we're practicing. What's the background to our field? So this is how I tend to break up subject matter. If we just look at drawing in the fine arts, which I think is a subject that doesn't always get too much attention, what we'll start to notice is that this same equation works really well and was the subject of Bernice Alice Rose's 1978 exhibition, Allegories of Modernism, where she defined drawing in the fine arts or by modern artists as this, or as working with this binary. So for example, the modern artists would take this, but instead of synthesizing it like an artist in the Renaissance might, instead what they were doing was playing with the binary in a way to try to subvert one or the other terms. So someone like Cy Twombly was trying to question the idea of the personal, the autograph, kind of the authored stroke. And he was doing that by creating a rational plan, following handwriting exercises, looking at graffiti, and actively making scribbles that depersonalize the mark. At least that was his intention. We can also see that with Andy Warhol, who was loading ink onto pages prior to his screen printing practice, and then pressing them onto other surfaces to kind of create drawings almost like a Xerox machine. which in essence creates a rational plan that then removes the subjective, right, or the autographic. So this could also be followed into postmodernism as an active animating principle for how fine artists think about drawing today. So if you do have an interest in galleries and museums and appreciating something outside of illustration, this would be a way to think about it or begin a conversation. This is, to me, synonymous with our problem. The autographic and the rational is equivalent to gesture and anatomy in some sense. Anatomy is something that's codified, it's a plan, and gesture is personal, right? So we can see echoes of this. And as we start to work towards, what I know everybody would like to do, which is how do I make a gesture drawing? I'm going to make you wait on this. The reason for is I don't think there's a lot of value to just learning how in an isolated way. So what I'd like to share is beyond that, why I do this, and then we'll aim it at a subject, and that could be the what. It doesn't have to just be a figure, although it will be today. I'll use an approach similar to this for animals, or really anything that I want to have an analytical relationship to in terms of drawing. The problem I would see with just how or just learning technique is that it's often restrictive, right? It could lead to kind of a static style, or it might just lead to mimicry without having a lot of kind of personal importance behind it. So let's begin with the why. And there's going to be a few things here that I'm going to try to share or try to look at. But the first is pretty broad, but also the most important. And it's just, what is your concept? I think gesture at some point, ideally, should connect with this. And this could take any type of manifestation. If you just want to make a character look a certain way, gesture works for that. If you just want to organize some kind of rhythmic landscape, it works for that. If you would like to do something that's a little bit more in line with modern practices or anything that's more fine art based, you could still think in the same way. The principle or the historical area that I think we should begin with, at least as an effort to think how this has been used in prior times, is the Renaissance. And the Renaissance, just because we all seem to locate it as some kind of touchstone. We've all maybe copied a Michelangelo or fetishized a Michelangelo. And so it's worth maybe taking a look at what they were doing relative or for this reason. So the Renaissance, as you all probably know, means rebirth. What were they giving birth to? Something they didn't really have access to. So you could also consider this, in a way, maybe one of the first concept art projects. Antiquity was largely absent. Donatello would search behind markets in kind of fields that were covered in cow manure to excavate different ruins and columns in order to measure them for notes. But it was kind of largely codified in Vitruvius's Guide to Architecture, which was a remaining text that they were all able to kind of study and pull from. And we would know this because we're all familiar with the Vitruvian Man, who I'm going to poorly draw over here. I don't need to do it too well because it's so iconic, everybody knows. So we got a figure, and then we have, all the limbs outstretched, and then we'd have the box. So this was the book cover to Vitruvius's Guide, the Da Vinci version, to architecture, which was, again, the rational plan. So this is the rational aspect to the Renaissance, is that they're giving birth to principles of antiquity. What we see in Da Vinci's is really an effort at abstraction. Abstraction probably has associations to weird artists, high in hallucinogens, tossing paint out of different parts of their body into different areas. But it's very normal, and it's something that we work with often, just in the process of drawing. It just means to withdraw, right? To take away the essence of something. And so what Da Vinci is doing is abstracting the figure to create a synthesis with two really important shapes. The square, which was thought to be symbolic of the earth or the terrestrial, and the sphere, which was considered to be divine or the absolute. So if we just simply look at what the Vitruvian Man shows us, it's the figure suspended between the square and the circle, or essentially as a conduit, a bridge between the two. The goal of the Renaissance was to study from the figure, which was the center, and create a bridge for people to understand the divine on the earth, right, or in their everyday landscape. So that is a huge concept, right? It's the cultural project that the Renaissance artists were working with, even though they had slightly different takes or lines or specific styles or looks to it. It was all emanating from the same place. That's something that we don't really have as a total today. We don't have an agreed on project. One thing that we do have, though, that might come relatively close is storytelling, character design. And one thing that is interesting to me about character design, even though I'm not a character designer and didn't invent this, was just the use of abstraction for how stories are told. This is something I could consider to be gesture as well, where we could look at, that basic Disney lineup of character and archetype and connect with the role that each character would have in a story prior to sitting through 2 hours, right? So these basic shapes have a really specific recall for us. And archetypes is a principle that would have been initiated by Carl Jung, who was a psychoanalyst and academic that was a contemporary to Freud. It was, I think, popularized by Joseph Campbell's The Hero with a Thousand Faces, which is a great structuralist study of literature and how many stories are of the same mold. And then I believe that was popularized in entertainment culture by George Lucas and Star Wars. But today we see it everywhere. So we could see, this type of lineup and identify these shapes as all number of stories, right? Where there's a hero, a heroine, a brute, sidekicks, a villain. And we all understand how those characters operate, not based on detail, but maybe based just on their shapes. So just on the idea that a hero might be squared, a female princess in the earlier stereotypical Disney films might be driven by fluid lines, and rhythm and curve in that sense would be to seduce the hero or a seductive visual. The brute has a top heavy weight in order to create a tension as if it might fall onto the hero, etc., etc. So that's a very clear example for me of abstraction. The abstract elements working to produce a concept or an understanding. And that's what the why would be. That's maybe one of the first steps to consider in gesture. What are your big goals? What are the big ideas? And how can your formulation of materials, line, shape, color, value, begin to communicate that at a very early stage? Okay, so I think that's enough in the big mapping or the big planning. So what we're going to do after this is start to move down the list. This first one, so say number one, at heart is entirely about some kind of idea and an effort to make it communicate, right? It's trying to create some type of language that does cross outside of your immediate interest or your immediate group of friends and communicate to a larger audience. So this is very subjective. It's very much about what you're interested in. The next 2 or 3 are specific to the figure. So I've kind of laid some of this bare so that you would see my thought process, how I go through thinking about gesture in order to interpret a figure. And so the next will be my arguments for this approach. Again, you don't have to buy them. You could take just the organization and maybe fit your own interests into it. But this is going to be the way that I'll move forward when we start to look at our skeleton. So 2 for me is weight. And so what I'm going to be looking at is how these types, or how this specifically, manifests in the figure as a principle of study, right? So how does weight work? And then in this investigation, I'll use that to start to pull themes that I'll then organize in the actual process under the how. So if we're going to start to look at weight, what we should also be a little bit clear with is what is it that we're drawing, right? So that kind of got messed over there. What we're drawing is the 8 parts of the figure. So your figure has, or a figure has, 8 basic parts. And maybe the early goal of gesture is to think about how to organize them, right? Think about how to create some kind of flow and unity out of those disparate parts. So as we move down, we just have a pre-drawn skeleton here to save us a little bit of time. So what are 8 parts here? Pretty simply, head, we have a rib cage, we have a pelvis, we have 2 legs, we have 2 arms, and that leaves us with the 8th, which to me is the most important. That would be the spine. So much of what I do with gesture comes as a result of looking very closely at the spine. So again, what we're talking about is the idea of weight and balance. So I want to look at our skeleton or at our figure just to see how and in what ways this occurs. The reason that I start with this is I started out drawing teaching myself, and I would look at comics. And what I thought the goal was to just replicate as closely as I could what I saw in the comic. And a result, what I ended up with was some outlined figure that had a lot of development in the pecs and the abs, a lot of rendering there. But by focusing so much on the outside, I created something that was really stiff and almost weightless. So something like that. It doesn't have a lot of balance, or doesn't feel as if there's some kind of organic naturalism that I could identify with as real or as realistic. It's not that you can't do this. Let's say an exception to my rule would be South Park. South Park is entirely designed of symmetrical forms and characters that are static. To me, that's a purposeful use of design in order to offset maybe the heady or subversive humor, right? Or the political nature of the topics that are covered in the show. This is a great idea or vehicle for that because it's disarming. It looks ridiculous, right? Or it looks non-realistic. So to go back to our basic figure, spine, what does it teach us about weight and balance? Well, our spine has 3 parts. The first one is your cervical, and there's 7 of those. I don't draw them all, so that's not something that I think you would have to necessarily do either. It would end at a noticeable landmark here, which is the 7th cervical vertebrae. That's this little guy here. From there, we would then have the thoracic, which is an opposing directional column. So we could think of this as maybe a big C curve. But again, we would have 7 vertebrae, 12 vertebrae here. Something that I'd recommend paying attention to, because this is how I would start to separate out animals. You could look at animals as having different spines just based on these counts. So not that we're going to talk about animals, but for example, a horse would have 18 thoracic vertebrae. And that extends the spine in a way that allows the rib cage to be longer so that it can have a larger digestive tract. At the bottom, we'll have our lumbar, and that is moving the opposite way. So from the get-go, from the most important stacking of bones to how we work and live and move, what we see is no straight, vertical, or horizontal, only diagonals, and diagonals that are in counterposition to one another. So our natural way for absorbing weight and movement is based on a very precarious idea of balance, offset diagonals. If we look at how that manifests in the figure, just simply to have the cervical section projecting forward puts the head out in front of the body. To have the thoracic section moving opposite forces the larger form of the rib cage, which comes from it, to be set at a counter angle. The lumbar leading to the pelvis puts that at a position that is offset to that of the rib cage. So thematically, what I can start to think of here really early, just by taking a more critical look at the skeleton, is we are kind of organized like a chaotic tower, where one thing is only vertical or upright because it's balanced on that of the last. So to me, this is something that evokes a certain naturalism now, that we aren't static forms like that. There's a bit of chaos to the way that we're organized and even the way we move. So think about what it is to walk or run. You have to throw yourself out of balance in order to catch it again. So there's quite a bit of this kind of chaotic design in naturalistic movement. We could see this same thing, this offset design of weight and balance in the legs. The femur is a C curve that kind of projects forward. That's balanced off a lower leg that might have more of a backward inclination, right? In other words, it's not completely vertical and static like this. To look at other areas, we could see maybe the leg from the back. Sometimes I'll design or think of this as a lightning bolt, right? We could see the femur having this pretty dramatic inward movement. That's something that you would want to exaggerate on women. Women have a femur that's going to angle more towards the center line. Men would be a little bit straighter. Sometimes I'll take a stylistic liberty and move the knee or kick the knee out, and then the lower leg back in again. That could even carry through down to the ankle, which would be offset from high to low, medial to lateral. So front to back, the legs are a lightning bolt, but still an expression of this chaotic theme or this complementary theme of balance, one thing supporting the next. And that's good for our bodies, right? Because the leg needs to be able to absorb weight, impact, all of those things. If we took a slightly different perspective, instead of just the organization of bone and direction, we're also balancing acts of texture. Hard surface, soft, connecting. Hard surface for the rib cage, soft area of connection for the waist, very soft for me. Bony area for the pelvis, soft intersection for the hip, and so on and so forth. And that's something that I would try to evoke in the drawing, perhaps by way of line weight, right? Maybe sharper, straighter lines for bone, softer, more graded lines for muscle or fat. But this is something I think if we really started to dive and look at the arms, the face, additional areas, we would still see these echoes of weight and balance everywhere. Okay, so that's one look through, weight and balance. 3, I like to consider the idea that the figure has to be or communicate some quality of movement or motion. The idea that we have a relationship to seeing one another all the time in some pose or motion, the process of moving. So I have to develop a how or a relationship to the how that evokes that, right? That gives a sense of some type of visual motion. That's going to lead us finally to the how. So how am I going to make the drawings? It's really simple. Deceptively simple for how much talking and diagramming I've been doing. The how for me is pretty contained to 3 lines, a straight, a C, or an S, or any variation of those. An S could be this, a C could be that. And then when I would move past gesture, I would only employ from there 3 shapes or 3 perspectives, a sphere, a box, and a cylinder. So that's it. How are they going to be organized? What we'll see if we look at a lot of art history is for naturalism, there's a pretty consistent use of curve and line throughout most subject matter. That is this. And I'm going to take a little break to show you some images so that you can see that this idea of asymmetry doesn't belong to me and it doesn't belong to anyone, but it's something that is rampant throughout the arts. But just the idea that to create balance, to create motion, to create an idea that might be naturalistically resonant with the figure, one of the best ways to do that is always making sure that one curve offsets the one prior or after, and that you leave a little space in between that you could consider to be kind of the handoff area. In other words, you just don't want it to end up looking too kind of disparate or disconnected. So in that sense, what we're really starting to deal with here is abstraction, right? To go back to the term that we prior addressed. The way that I think of this is that every line represents a part. So we talked about there being 8 parts, head, spine, all that. Whenever I'm breaking the figure down or trying to abstract it into a gesture, what I'm really doing is taking each part, not drawing it or copying it, understanding the idea of its movement, and then exaggerating it through some reference to a diagonal or curve. The area that is in between, that I kind of hatch there, I think of as joints. This would be the area of transition, the shoulder, the knee, the neck. The goal is, at least one way of thinking of the goal, is to create a pathway for the viewer that moves their eye all the way down from head to foot. Right? So this is a principle of rhythm, where we could see how all of these lines communicate the figure, right, in abstraction as a series of lines, but it's trying to organize a larger composition, a larger way of thinking of the figure as a cohesive whole, and how to engage your audience, right, by starting them with a head and then moving them down progressively. So I think before we go into a performance for how that's done, I want to show you other examples, just a few historically where we can see this. That way you have a broader appreciation before we narrow it into my specific technique for how. So what we have here is a few drawings by Michelangelo. That you can find these in Watson Gupsell reproductions of his sketchbooks or any number of books on Michelangelo. There's no shortage of them. And what you could see here is an abstraction, right? So it's not the contour. This isn't a completed line that moves around the figure in a way that totalizes its silhouette. Instead, there's a lot of passage, right? So there's a lot of open area. And what we can start to identify with early on is the use of curve to create motion. So this curve, for example, looks kind of like what we just drew, except mine's not as good. That leads into this. This curve is counterbalanced to this knee. That creates a movement and a flow from that knee into this calf, bringing the eye all the way through. Right, so that's, I think, one good example. You could see it in the arms as well. And then on some figures, you'll notice that those lines become even more distinct and isolated. Like on this leg, it's hardly there. It's a representation of the thigh. But that's what I kind of mean by considering the part as reduced to curve or line. for the benefit of creating motion. So here this flows into maybe this grouped design for sartorius knee and tibia, and then into calf there. There's nothing here that I think we need to take other than the idea that principles of gesture and rhythm predate all of us, are owned by no one, and have been used to distill the essence of the figure down for hundreds of years. This is maybe my favorite drawing Michelangelo ever made. This is on a note to his friend. So you can see the writing over here, telling him how much it sucks to paint the Sistine Chapel because of his posture. So this, over here says, I hate doing this. My neck hurts. I want to stop. But what we can see is he's illustrated that so that he can make a quick drawing to sell the idea of how much his posture is hurting him. And by the way, I started with really broad, kind of maybe overly heady ways of thinking about gesture relative to history or different genres. It can also just be an interpretation of someone's pose, right? Somebody's stance, somebody's exterior emotional projection, anything like that. It could be as simple as this. So what we have here is him demonstrating the position, painting what looks like God or a rare Pokemon on the ceiling. And then if we look at and study his line work, same thing. Neck is a curve that leads into a counter curve that could here be represented by the thoracic spine, which leads into a counter rhythm that could be the abdomen, hip, leg, right, all the way down. So it's notational in a sense. It provides an understanding of the figure, but primarily rhythm. So I'm kind of hopscotching here through history just to show you that everybody's used it. Everybody that has kind of embraced a commercial aspect or a popular aspect to the arts has always dealt with line in a way that's told a story or created a rhythmic interpretation of the figure. William Hogarth, for example, is pretty famous for it. He wrote a whole treatise on it called The Analysis of Beauty. It's not too bizarre to think overly philosophical about what we're doing with drawing because it's common. His basic idea was, all pictures are made from unity and then develop variety within. So if we think about, his triangle as something that's unifying the picture, his serpentine S-curve is something that creates variety. You could see that over here. Like the basic idea of the shrimp girl is that she's a triangle. And if we follow the curve from her face into her chest, you have this basic model essentially created in portrait, right? Something that might be considered gesture for the painting, right? So principles of gesture or rational planning are also super conducive to painting as well. And I put here some of his text or how he thought about line and what it created for him, because I think it's really interesting for what it is we're dealing with. He called it a pregnancy of the moment, an aesthetic suspension. And he talks a lot about how line for him is serpentine and that it's with its own character. It dips out of sight and returns again. It gives play to the imagination. It delights the eye. It's informed by a quantity and variety of contents. So these principles are not, again, mine, but you find them throughout art history everywhere. Disney is probably the most famous for them. So on page 68 of The Illusion of Life, which is like the big tome that I think in a sense documents Disney's aesthetic development, what you can see is a fascinating description of what they say is appeal, which appeal really is just aesthetic. And aesthetic is loosely translated in philosophy as the science of the beautiful, right? But there's no science to beauty, so it's different for everybody. But what you can see here is in just the box on the bottom left, what I started with by saying in my figure when I was copying from comics, how everything was too symmetrical and didn't feel like there was any sense of dimension or solidity. That's what maybe Steamboat really was for them. That's also what it looks like to go bankrupt, right? They were losing money hand over fist. So they went through like a diagnostic of how they were presenting their line and the conception of line for animation and realism. And they just landed on what I already showed you, right? That was common to Michelangelo, common to Hogarth, asymmetry, right? And they say that in the little description there, in nature, we see forms in balance, right? That's a way of conceiving of naturalism. So even Disney wasn't stubborn in the sense that it's just looking at their own development, their own work. He was kind of voraciously devouring art history for things that he could bring into his own aesthetic and industry. And so what we could see with the asymmetry, the bottom left, is the birth of Snow White, essentially. And that's what we see here, which was revolutionary aesthetically and technically. I think we still think of Disney as maybe the touchstone for realism in animation. And even if you don't like Disney, which I know it's unpopular to like Disney, they still own everything, right? Yeah. Marvel, Star Wars, your next born, everything. So this is something that I think gives credence to what it is we're doing, right? It at least kind of presents a case study, right? If not from history here, specifically from popular culture. If you're more interested in the illustration side of things, Andrew Loomis, in his creative illustration, basically lays out an aesthetic treatise, just like William Hogarth. He's showing you in the chapter on line his basic 7 functions, right? And what does line do? It conveys beauty. It's a serpentine line that conveys beauty, and then it has these 6 other qualities. And he talks about it in very poetic terms, maybe a little too sappy for me, but he calls it, the curved line is the voyager's delight and is a pleasure to the eye. It can stir the soul. Wind and water both move in curved and waves form, right? So it's really romantic in his description, but it's not someone that's just making a drawing. It's someone that's developed a rational system or a rational understanding that then takes that and puts his mark making or his own signature into the mark making in whatever ad he's making or painting he's making. You would find images like this in creative illustration. This is, I think, an interesting diagram just for the sense that it's not specific to the figure, but you could still see the way that one curve leads the eye into another, leads the eye into somewhere else. So as an organizing principle, this works just as well on a landscape, an animal, or a person. And that's it. So just a few examples to show. So we looked at a few images just to give you an idea of how other people might think of the same and how applicable, really, some of the information that we set up here is. So that's all about movement, right, and motion. So I think it's probably time that we did some, right? We did a few drawings now that I've subjected you to all of this. So we're going to use some photographs, and I'm going to be making some gesture drawings from them just to try to illustrate some of the principles that we already set down. The first thing that I'm going to be doing is giving you a bit of a list that you can choose to follow if you like. So the first thing that I always do is start with the head. There's no reason that you have to do this. There's only dozens of ways to make a gesture drawing. I like to start with the head because it's the area of focus. When we look at people, we look at their heads and not at their belly buttons or their elbows, hopefully. So the head is, I think, a great place to anticipate where your viewer's engagement will be. Some people will start with the body. That's fine too. From there, I work into the spine. I break the spine into 4 lines: cervical, thoracic, lumbar, but also one for the stretch of the abdomen. From there, I go into the weight-bearing leg. I think it's really important to begin a dialogue with how weight is being used in your figure. And again, this is open. It doesn't have to be a leg. It could be a knee or a shoulder, right? Depending on how your figure is set up and balanced. So I think that this as a study, the systematic nature of it is to set oneself up for invention. So I'm only using the reference as a way to illustrate the basic concept and what it is that I'm looking at. But I think that this is maybe one of the best ways to begin to think about inventing. From there, supporting leg or a support. And then lastly, the arms. In total, my gesture drawings never really exceed 14 to 15 lines. They're all going to be asymmetrical. So I'm going to be setting it up the same way. Each line will be a simplified part. Each joint will be kind of this open space in between that allows their transition. You want to keep this in mind like you're playing pinball with the eye, just kind of forcing the viewer's attention from the apex of one curve to the apex of the next. Right? This is what's going to create that sensation of flow or rhythm. From here, let's try it out. So first thing is, what's the head doing? I'm just going to start with a ball. My basic ball is fine. From there, I'm going to start to look for the spine. The natural or the intuitive thing to do at this point would be to say, oh yeah, I see this line right on the shoulder, or I see that line, that's the neck. I'm not doing that. So what I'm doing is I understand the spine as that series of directional asymmetrical tilts or leans. So the goal would be to start to envision that in the figure. So instead of looking at the outside, I'm trying to look at and understand what governs it. directionally. So if I look at this figure, the spine would be coming out toward me in space. So it'd be doing something more like this. I know for sure what it's not doing is it's not doing that. Otherwise, we wouldn't be balanced. We would fall over, which could be kind of funny.
Ow!
So here would be the head. Think of this as your compositional beginning. And then from there, I'm going to pull the eye out. So here's my interpretation of the cervical section, the cervical spine. From there, we can catch that motion and counter it. And now I'm going to be thinking about the thoracic spine. The thoracic spine is buried inside the rib cage. It's not the contour. So my thinking of gesture and why I find it to be relatively useful for invention is that this constitutes a blueprint or a beginning. It's inside. So, it's somewhere in here. Every stage in my drawing process sneaks closer and closer towards the outside. And for me, that's really useful and sometimes necessary.
Necessary?
Because it's labor intensive and somewhat insane to start to think about drawing a direct contour and getting everything right, from gesture to shape to perspective, right, all the way down the list. One thing that I'd like to mention before we go any further with this basic setup is one thing that we should talk about, because we never really fully made the transition here. We talked about how anatomy was a rational plan, how it represented something that's a lot more static in terms of its relationship to gesture. But now that we have this thinking of asymmetry, and we've related that asymmetry to what's important about the skeleton, we can maybe take a quick look at the outside, right? To think about how this way of thematically presenting line to govern and unify the 8 parts does apply to your outside. So if we look at quickly here the contour, what I could see on this model would be the deltoid, the tricep, the bicep, the coracoid brachialis is in here, the bicep ending, the ridge group, the medial epicondyle, extensors and flexors, the softened area of the radius for the saddle joint of the thumb, and then into the hand. So one thing I'd like to point out here, just to kind of summarize the main topic, is that the way that we're thinking about gesture is really to anticipate anatomy. Because what is anatomy but a series of antagonistic groups, right? So the idea of the deltoid flows into the bicep or flows into the tricep. So this inside way of organizing shape and skeleton is your contour. So in that sense, the gesture is the beginning and the end. It's the inside and the outside simultaneously. I would have started out drawing it more like this, just because I'd be focused on detail in the inside. If this were to be realistic, we would think about how inside here, this would mean that muscles would have to be symmetrical. And if your muscles were symmetrical, you wouldn't be able to move. You wouldn't have the passive, right, and active organization of one muscle group allowing the other to work by raising or flexing or extending. Instead, something like this might cause you to vibrate violently and then explode. So I think that was important to me just as an aside. Right, so that even though we are drawing inside the figure, and I'm describing to you that I'm not looking specifically at the contour, it really is in anticipation of a more developed or comprehensive understanding of the outside. So as we return to the idea here of this thoracic, even though I am pretty formulaically putting these lines down, you could look for visual cues or clues as far as how you might understand that direction. For example, I wouldn't see a push of the rib cage against the skin there if the rib cage wasn't thrown forward, if it wasn't angled forward. If it was just straight up and down, there would be absolutely no emphasis, right, or point of pressure on the skin at all. So that's now going to be balanced off my thinking of the abdomen. So I think of the abdomen as kind of like stretching really from the sternum down to the pelvis. So I'm kind of thinking of a big relational line here, like that. I'm not of the school that, line drawing or your lines when making a drawing have to exhibit some kind of absolute precision. I know that's kind of the fad for drawing now, where every line is finished and it seems to have like a relationship to product design or product drawing, which I think is really interesting. But my lines are messy. I don't feel like the same need or the same pressure to treat the lines like that. So here we have stretch. That leads me into lumbar, and number 2 is done. Right, so that's the spine. From the spine, we're going to look for the hip or pelvis. There's a summary shape for the pelvis as I work into the weight-bearing leg. which is this back one here. And then when I move into the leg, I'm going to do a line for the femur. I'm going to catch and counter that with the line of the lower leg, which is going to be an S curve, and then the foot. So that creates my first pathway. I get the head all the way down to the leg or to the foot. I haven't talked about proportion, and I think that's, for me, purposeful now because proportion is highly related to story. We'll come back to proportion, or I would develop proportion in a later lecture, actually. But if we look at 6.5 to 7.5 heads, maybe that's academic. 8 to 8.5 is heroic. 9.5 is fashion illustration. And then 11 to 13 would be mannerism. And Michelangelo was using like 11 to 13 head tall figures at the end of his career. Like look at God in the Sistine Chapel. He looks like a giant man with a baby head. So that's 3. You could check that off. Now 4 would be the supporting leg. And I'm going to introduce one other technique for creating line. In addition to asymmetry, I also use wrapping lines. So you could think of a wrapping line as a summary of a perspective, primarily a cylinder. Sometimes they're called cross contours or rubber band, something like that. Anything that gives an expression to the surface. And it doesn't have to be really clean and perfect. But if we erase the cylinder, that still gives me a basic idea or summary of the perspective, the direction of a form. So we'll start to pepper these in as we go. I usually do 2 to 3 per part. So if we do a couple here on the rib cage, I would throw it back. The pelvis, I would lean the opposite way to continue our understanding and thinking of asymmetry. The figure isn't just a 2-dimensional balancing act, it's a 3-dimensional balancing act as well. All right, so in space, those angles are also offsetting to allow for balance. Here's the femur, so that looks like it's going away. So I'm going to put a couple rubber bands there. Now to the supporting leg, we can pick off any existing rhythms. So maybe I'll use the pelvis or the lumbar, and then femur. Sometimes for the bent leg, I'll put a little extra line to bounce the movement from the femur into the lower leg. And that's here. Usually my lines for the lower leg are an S curve, just to pick up on some of the movement or height of that calf. And there's the supporting leg, maybe a few wraps. Which direction is that going? Maybe comes out. And then arms. So any line that I have already, I can develop off of. But you want every line to kind of speak to what's around it in order to have that comprehensive or unified sense of flow. If you think of this in terms of pathways, really, your eye should be going to every other line and leading you to every other part of the figure as a natural kind of extension of this technique. So for the arm, off the neck maybe, then into the humerus, I can catch that and put that into the forearm. And I always do kind of like a somewhat of a hand shape, but you don't have to get overdeveloped. What I did for the feet was I always just use some variation of a triangle. So I think it's important just to get the foot planted. So a front view might have a triangle that's pretty even. A 3/4 foot might just extend that and put the straight over here. A profile foot for now might just be longer without that front plane. For this one, the one where the foot is raised, I'm thinking of stretch and pinch basically, or this sock shape, but pinched here. So keeping some kind of triangle helps to show a ground plane and maybe a better or more convincing sense of weight. So if we did the arm on this side, here's shoulder, and maybe this plays off of the stretch or that thoracic curve of the rib cage into the humerus, catch and counter into the forearm, and that comes out into the hand. So you had to listen to all that buildup just to make a wavy stick figure.
Yeah!
One thing to pay attention to here is that every line, in order to maintain that sense of kind of movement or dynamic quality, is diagonal. So none of my lines are vertical or horizontal. Everything exists on some type of a diagonal. Even that stretched line for the spine, it would just be 2 diagonals. And so if you're keeping your lines too straight, or if your lines end up being too straight, it's going to be hard to keep that sensation of rhythm moving through the body. Okay, so let's try another one. Try some different views, different positions. So let's try this one. So a common questions I would get with gesture is, how do I foreshorten it? How do I show perspective? Well, it's not really the goal. Something that you could consider with your own figures is that I'm thinking of this as a process, primarily because the figure is so complex, or any organic form is so complex. I need steps in order to systematically interpret it. So for me, I would begin with a gesture, and then that would lead me to an analysis of weight based on tilts. And then I would incorporate the shapes of the body, and then I might connect them. And then I would study landmarks and then perspective. So a lot of the times I develop a drawing like I would a paper or a talk. It's based on the division of labor, of introducing one subject at a time in pieces so that the whole will have more resonance. And then the last thing I would look for is anatomy. So I think sometimes gesture can be frustrating for people if your expectations of it are dramatically divorced from what it's supposed to be. It's just an organizational effort, right? At this point, you're trying to plan for the finish. You're trying to embrace some kind of idea, whether it's about movement, like in my case, or like in Loomis's cases, larger relational rhythms. Mine is like more fragmented, more akin to Glenn Vilppu. You can make it whatever you want. So in that sense, it's not the time for perspective. You can do a little bit with the ellipses as far as getting those kind of summary directions like I did with the wrapping lines, but don't make it something it doesn't need to be. So for this one, here's my head, and then cervical is a little more bent here, thoracic, maybe we'll do a pinch. So what I'm doing on this is reversing the lines. So this figure is extended, upright. This figure is leaned over. I want you to notice that I formulaically always use these lines. That's why I think it lends itself so well to invention. But in different postures, you just have to reorganize some of the lines in order to allow for a different interpretation. So here I can just flip it. I'll make this longer, and then I'll create thoracic, and then into a thinking of abdomen or lumbar here. All right, so it gives a little bit more of a pinch. Then into pelvis. So as I go through, I'm asking myself, does this line that I just put down relate to any of the prior? Right, that would be my main area of consideration. Wrapping lines might help me think about how this guy's leaned. There's a weight on this side. That naturally shifts the pelvis up. Here's my femur, knee, lower leg, and then triangle for foot. We give a little bit of a wrap for these. And then this has a curve this way, and then over shoulder. And pick up off that stretch line on the back, humerus, forearm. Usually I'll treat the forearm as a continuation into the hand, as one long line. So I'll try to create like a big C curve there to make that feel as though it's not broken in terms of the movement. C curve here, humerus, radius, ulna, and then into hand. And then I'd be ready to start putting masses on top. Let's try a back view. So one thing you'll notice when we do a back view is that you could treat it the exact same way as the front view. Head, cervical, thoracic, stretch, lumbar, pelvis for the weight-bearing side here. Right, that's exactly what I did on the front view. The only thing is kind of small notations for context. Here I'm seeing the back of the skull. Here I'm seeing maybe a little bit of the front. But as we shift now into the weight-bearing leg, here's the femur. Maybe I'll create a long rhythm, kind of Loomis-like there. That's fine to do as well. Catch and counter that into the lower leg. If you're really concerned with your proportion and you don't want to wait for a forthcoming lecture or study books from proportion, I just think this is the halfway point. So when you're doing your gestures, what you could do is, as soon as you get from head to pelvis, you could just copy that space and even set up like a little ground plane so you don't exceed that distance. I think that's a good way to try to organize standing poses. It does represent an 8-head figure though, which, it has an aesthetic direction to it. It's more heroic, more fashion-like. Supporting leg on this side. Maybe if these lines exist kind of towards the back of the figure, I'll treat it a little bit lightly or more lightly. But again, I'm not worried about this as something that's final or finished. Here's some wraps. For the back, the only thing I add that's a little different from the front would be the scapula. So I think the scapula, or the area of the scapula right there, gives a great opportunity for rhythm. Like if we look at that or consider it a part and distill it into a curve, you can relate that curve to any of the lines around the spine, and then use it as a directional prompt to develop into the deltoid. And then you don't always have to break up every part. This could be a longer rhythm or a longer line. And then on this side, same thing. So that would be done. Let's try another. Let's do one more standing before we get into seated pose. Head. You can even count the lines if you want. Again, it's keeping it really brief. The reason, again, I try to keep it brief is if you're inventing, or even if you're drawing from life, one thing that I don't want to do is invest a lot of time and energy into something that's going to suck, right? Or that isn't what I want ultimately. So if I'm always putting out a lot of energy, always spending a ton of time developing an ideation or a sketch, it's really counterproductive. Like that's energy that could go into finishing or developing a better idea. So this 14 to 16 line rule is really about kind of conserving my energy. But if you're drawing from life or on location, it's also a way to have a rapid system to get the figure down with a limited amount of time. So here would be cervical, thoracic, stretch, lumbar, weight, pelvis, femur. One thing I like to play around with, and this might lead us into invention a little bit more, is messing with the pose. Right? So I don't really think there's any inherent value, one, in spending a lot of time on something. Nobody pays you, if you're going into a commercial industry, for how much time you spent on something. They just pay you per job. So the faster you can do something or the more economical you can be, the better ultimately for you in the long run. So all that matters is the idea that you have about the pose. So maybe I don't like this pose. That's fine. There's no drawing police or representational police that's going to come to your home and give you a ticket for not doing it faithfully. Maybe I make this more diagonal. Maybe I like the whole diagonal of this pose, right? And a straighter leg communicates that better. That could be one thing. The other thing that maybe I just like the foot to be a continuation of that line. The other thing I might look at times is how we organize our balance. One way you could look for that is if you imagine where the pit of the neck would be, which would be on the other side there. I'll use that and plumb it. So if it's near the weight-bearing ankle, it's a balanced posed, or it's a way to think about creating a balanced pose. So maybe play with that. Try distorting that. Instead of having the leg there, what if I were to push it back here? What type of content does that produce that might be different from the pose? This is less balanced. Maybe now we're thinking about that pregnancy of the moment more, like Hogarth. The idea that something is about to happen, right, by taking this further away. Or maybe I explore, putting it back here and only kind of tenuously balancing the figure, like there's some fall, right? And I haven't included the staff just to illustrate that idea. So there's no inherent value in copying what you see. The only value really is that you communicate an idea. So finish off putting some arms. Here's a scapula shape. Here's the deltoid. Here's the upper arm, lower arm. So to address foreshortening briefly, again, there's not a lot you could do with space. So the things that will be useful will be wrapping lines. And I'll do a foreshortened pose just so you have an option to see that. But what I'll do is all of my lines are pretty formulaic and predetermined in length. So I'll adjust for the length of a line. So instead of, like, if I wanted to, for example, foreshorten this leg, or let's say this leg, because I haven't drawn it as much, right? That's coming straight out or perpendicular to our plane of viewing. If I wanted to push it further away in a gesture, I would shorten the line just to communicate the foreshortening, the diminishing in the size or the length, right? So that would be over here, and then maybe this lower leg is still coming back. Or if I wanted this arm to go away, like this would be the average length for the gesture. If this were reaching out and away, maybe I would just make the gesture line for this arm that long, shorten, right, the hand. But that's it, right? What I really need to show foreshortening would be overlapping. And I'm not using completed shapes yet, right? So we're just playing around with rhythm, which would be, again, the guiding kind of directional through line for those. Let's try a foreshortening one. So head. Sometimes if you want to work with pushing the idea or the concept disconnected from what you actually see. So maybe you have a specific habit of being too connected to what it is that you're drawing. Sometimes instead, if I look at a pose, I'll try to identify like a term, like excited or dynamic or whatever it is, that then could become more of the basis for what I'm trying to get from the drawing. Right? That way you kind of put something in between what it is that you're doing and then the reference. That might just be whatever the pose suggests to you naturally. So this will be kind of like the other one where we just reverse those lines. So no weight-bearing leg on this one, just weight-bearing bottom. Let's do this back leg. So maybe I'll just shorten that a little bit and then shorten the line for the lower leg into the foot. And then on this side, this leg comes up. So sometimes what I'll do for foreshortening or when there's a lot of limbs that are kind of stacked one on top of the other is I'll do the further leg first in order to make the line lighter. And then like another thing that we could do for foreshortening is if I work darker on top of the lighter, it'll give some sense of depth just because of the value, kind of like atmospheric perspective in painting. So I had that in mind for this. Here's some perspective lines. And then again, scapula. So benefit again to the technique is organization and concept. Let's try this one too. So for this one, there's a few things that we could look at specific to the topic. This is obviously gesture. We've talked about how it's connected by way of design to anatomy and even expressive of the passive and active anatomical shapes on some level. But how could we use gesture maybe in a different way to think about prepping ourselves for anatomy, like the more specific anatomical shapes? Sometimes what I'll do when I'm going through a gesture like this one is I might use darker lines or areas of improved or increased line weight to point out important zones or regions. One thing that's really important for me in anatomy in terms of a drawing is to not replicate an anatomy diagram, right? Anatomy chart. Just my personal taste, what I tend not to like so much are breakdowns of the figure or drawings of the figure where every muscle is flexed and striated all the time, no matter what, even if someone's just drinking tea. Their muscles are strained and sweat is spraying off of them. So what I'll do is maybe I'll hit a darker line to pinpoint an area where I think it would make sense to develop anatomy. So the raise of a shoulder or the weight-bearing leg or maybe this hip for the outstretched leg behind could become areas of focal point. In terms of thinking the addition of anatomy, a focal point for the development of muscles could be there or here. So that might look, like if we start to go inside. I think it makes sense to have areas of resolve in figures so that the viewer's attention isn't taxed, right? By having to look at the rendered whole. They can instead see areas that might be suggested, like the waist or the oblique or the serratus, but then areas that have a little bit more definition. I think that can help essentially give a stronger interpretation of the figure and the dynamic effort of anatomy throughout that pose, right? So something like that. Or if we look at the shoulder, and this, even though it breaks, my workflow, it would be kind of prior to doing tilts, shapes, right? Because that would be, something that I would want to do is set up the skeleton and the landmarks and the perspectives before doing the anatomy. But it's a fun exercise at times to do just as a way to see if you can maintain all those ideas, those properties of form and perspective, solidity, while going directly to the lines. So I wouldn't say it's something I do a lot, but I think it is a good exercise when you're in a funk or you just want something different to do. Like I said, I love comics and I'm older, so I grew up with the image revolution. So everything was like Rob Liefeld, who I know is very popular to dislike, Jim Lee, Todd McFarlane, Mark Silvestri, all those guys. In the context of teaching, I think of anatomy as having a right and a wrong. But I also do an exercise where students submit things that are clearly wrong. Usually it's anime. Sometimes it's cartoons. Sometimes it's CG work. And we go through and dissect it in order to not bash it, but critically appreciate what's been done that deviates from the norm. And that's how I think of this era of comics, which I was copying. Like there is a detrimental aspect to copying Rob Liefeld, maybe proportions or like a lot of the anatomy I would say is expressive and not correct. But for me, it's correct in a different sense. Historically, it's correct because I think of image comics as like the Baroque reaction to the classicism of early Marvel and DC. So like John Romita, the poses are reserved, they're statuesque, the perspectives are relatively maintained. Like, so I would define the classical as something that respects the boundaries of the frame, that has a more conservative relationship in separating the comic itself from you. And I think that what was fascinating about the image group was that it was entirely excessive. So like Rob Liefeld, there's hardly a body, but there's an excessive amount of hatching, right? And it's true for a lot of them. The detail starts to take over the whole. And that's a historically consistent like category or material form of how Baroque works. Like the fragment becomes the total. So I think it's correct in that sense. If we try to take a classical filter to assess the image group, right, then I think it breaks down. All right, so this, I think at first glance would look like a really bizarre system of notes for gesture. Like I said at the beginning, the problem of gesture for me is really one of not only conceptual, but visual organization. And more than that, how the two relate, right? How what you're thinking manifests in what it is that you do. Quite often, I'll have one thought and produce something entirely different. And students all the time will show me something and describe it to me, and it looks nothing like what's there. To think gesture and anatomy can be localized as just a way to study the figure so that you appreciate what's maybe most natural, or in my opinion, most natural about it. But it could also be something, and my intention is also to give you a framework for organizing your broader ideas and thinking about how drawing as a subject, a whole subject throughout history, also exhibits the same tension of gesture and anatomy by way of thinking the personal and the cerebral, or the subjective and the rational. Yeah, so thank you for taking a little bit of a bizarre journey through how I think about gesture. I hope that it benefits you in some sense for kind of thinking of this nebulous subject. If you'd like to know more about me, I do have a book called Figure Drawing, Design, and Invention, and I do teach classes online at Brainstorm Academy. I teach an analytical anatomy, comparative anatomy, where we would take principles very much like what we described today, and we work through them, comparing horses, cats, dogs to people, and figure and composition. And that's at Brainstorm School online. All right, did it.
Yeah, thank you.